The city was quieter than usual that evening, wrapped in a mist that turned the streetlights into halos of gold. Mark walked slowly along the cracked sidewalk, hands deep in his coat pockets, his breath visible in the cooling air. The day had been long and heavy, filled with half-finished conversations and unspoken worries. It was one of those nights when everything felt slightly out of place, not broken, but uncertain, like a song slightly out of tune. He had just left the hospital. His younger sister, Emily, had been there for 3 days after a sudden fainting spell at work. The doctor said her condition wasn't serious, but tests were ongoing, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. She had always been the light of their small family, the one who believed easily, who prayed without hesitation. Mark, on the other hand, had grown careful with faith. It wasn't that he stopped believing in God. He just wasn't sure where God was in all the noise. As he walked home, his phone buzzed. A notification flashed from a friend. Evening prayer live stream, Sacred Heart Family. He hesitated. He remembered the channel. Emily had sent him a link weeks ago saying, "You'll like it, it's peaceful." That night, something inside him nudged softly. He pressed play. A calm voice filled the air through his headphones. "Before we turn in, we thank the Lord for making us part of his family." The words felt gentle, almost like they were directed at him. The prayer continued, speaking of unity, of standing firm in God's truth, of being part of something greater. One body, one home. Mark stopped walking. He stood beneath a streetlight, letting the words pour over him. "In a world that divides and confuses," the voice said, "we find peace tonight by standing in the truth of who we are, one body in Christ." He closed his eyes. For the first time in a while, he felt something other than worry. There was stillness. Beneath the cold and the noise, he felt, for just a second, that he belonged somewhere. When the video ended, Mark looked up. Across the street, the old stone church stood quietly, its windows dimly glowing. He'd passed it countless times, but had never stepped inside. Tonight, though, he felt drawn. He crossed the street and pushed the heavy wooden door open. The faint scent of incense and candle wax greeted him. Only a few people were there. An elderly man kneeling near the altar. A young woman lighting a candle near a statue of the Virgin Mary. Mark slipped into a pew near the back. For a while, he just sat in the silence. The world outside felt far away. After a few minutes, a priest approached, his footsteps soft. "Evening, son," he said gently. "You're welcome to stay as long as you like." Mark nodded. "Thank you, Father. I'm not really sure why I came." The priest smiled. "Most people who come here at night don't know. They just follow the quiet voice that calls." Mark looked down at his hands. "I was listening to a prayer online," he admitted. "Something about being part of God's household, about standing in truth. It just felt like I was supposed to hear it." The priest nodded thoughtfully. "That's Ephesians," he said. "St. Paul reminding us that we're no longer strangers, but members of God's family. Sometimes the world makes us forget who we are. But even when we wander, the family of God never forgets us." Those words lingered in Mark's heart long after he left the church. He walked home beneath a sky heavy with clouds. The city lights shimmered faintly against the low mist, and for once the quiet didn't feel empty. When he reached his apartment, he found Emily's rosary on the table. She had left it there before going to the hospital. He picked it up, the small wooden beads worn smooth from her hands. He sat by the window, the same prayer still echoing in his mind, built upon the foundation of the apostles with Christ as the capstone. He thought of Emily, her faith steady even in uncertainty. Maybe, he thought, that was what he lacked, a foundation. Not knowledge or certainty, but something solid beneath his doubts. He didn't pray aloud. Instead, he whispered something halfway between a sigh and a confession. "Lord, if you're still near, help me find my way back." Outside, the night deepened, the streetlights flickered. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed once, soft and low. And for the first time in months, Mark felt that maybe the silence wasn't absence, maybe it was invitation. That night, as he drifted into sleep, he dreamed of a great cathedral built not of stone but of light, where countless faces stood side by side, people he knew and strangers alike, all glowing with peace. He couldn't see Christ clearly, but he felt his presence at the center, holding everything together. And in that radiant stillness, he heard a whisper, "You are home." When morning came, Mark woke with the faintest smile. The world hadn't changed, but something inside him had begun to shift. He didn't yet know what faith would look like now, only that he was ready to begin again. The following evening, Mark returned to the hospital carrying a small bouquet of daisies for Emily. The halls smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee, the low hum of machines blending with the rhythm of muffled footsteps. When he entered her room, Emily was awake, sitting upright with a book of prayers open on her lap. Her face lit up the moment she saw him. "Hey," she said softly, smiling through fatigue. "You look better today." Mark laughed quietly. "I guess I slept for the first time in weeks." She tilted her head. "You prayed, didn't you?" He hesitated. "Sort of. I watched a prayer online last night and then stopped by that old church near 5th Street. Emily's eyes softened. "St. Anthony's?" "Yeah," he nodded. "I just needed somewhere quiet." She reached out and squeezed his hand gently. Sometimes quiet is where God waits the loudest. They sat together in peaceful silence. For years, Mark had avoided talking about faith with her. It wasn't hostility, just distance. She was the believer. He was the realist. But now, sitting by her bed, he realized how much her quiet trust had anchored him all along. After a while, a nurse entered, cheerful and brisk. "Good news," she said. "Your sister's latest test results look stable. She can probably go home in a few days." Mark exhaled deeply, a weight lifting off his chest. Emily smiled again. "See? God still writes good endings." That night, after leaving the hospital, Mark stopped by St. Anthony's again. The church was darker this time, lit only by a few flickering candles. Near the front pew sat the same priest from before. "Good evening," the priest said. "Back so soon?" Mark smiled faintly. "I guess I needed to be here again." He hesitated. "Can I ask you something, Father? How do you keep believing when everything feels uncertain? When you don't see answers?" The priest considered the question for a moment. "Faith doesn't mean we never doubt," he said gently. "It means we choose trust even while doubting. Skepticism, as Bishop Fulton Sheen once said, is often just fear dressed as intellect. But faith is courage dressed as humility." Mark looked down. "Courage and humility, that's not easy." "It never is," the priest replied. "But grace doesn't ask for perfection. It asks for openness." Those words stayed with him. On his way home, the city buzzed with evening life. Cafes glowing, laughter spilling onto sidewalks, couples walking hand in hand. Yet amid it all, Mark felt an unfamiliar calm. He realized that faith wasn't about escaping the world. It was about finding God within it. Over the next few days, he began to make small changes. He started ending his evenings by lighting a candle and saying a brief prayer. Nothing elaborate, just a quiet thank you. When Emily returned home, he helped her settle back into her apartment and promised to drive her to Mass that Sunday. She grinned, teasing him. "Are you coming too?" He pretended to think. "We'll see." But deep down, he already knew he would. Sunday came cold and gray, rain tapping gently on the church windows as they sat side by side in the pew. Mark hadn't attended Mass in years. The hymns felt both foreign and familiar. The priest's homily was on Ephesians, the same reading from the video he had listened to days earlier. "You are no longer strangers, but members of God's household," the priest said. "Christ is the cornerstone, and each of us is joined together in him." The words struck deep. He looked around, old couples, children, weary faces, all different, all praying as one. For the first time, he felt that invisible connection, that sense of belonging he had dreamt about. When the choir began to sing "Be Not Afraid," his throat tightened. After Mass, Emily hugged him. "It's good to see you here," she said. "You belong here, you know." He didn't answer, but something inside him agreed. In the weeks that followed, Mark began visiting the church regularly, sometimes sitting through evening prayers streamed from the same Sacred Heart family channel that had first called him back. He didn't tell anyone. It was his quiet routine, his nightly retreat from the world's noise. The prayers spoke of forgiveness, unity, and hope. They reminded him that even in darkness, light never stops shining. One evening, while sitting in the pew, he noticed a woman crying softly near the back. Without thinking, he walked over and offered her a tissue. She looked up, eyes red but grateful. "Thank you," she whispered. "I just lost my husband last month. I didn't know where else to go." Mark sat beside her in silence. "I didn't know where to go either," he admitted. "But I think God finds us when we can't find him." She smiled weakly. "I hope so." They prayed quietly together. No words exchanged, just presence. And in that silence, Mark realized something profound. Faith was never meant to be private. It was meant to connect, to heal the fractures between souls, to remind the broken they weren't alone. As the church bells chimed the hour, he glanced up at the crucifix. For the first time, he didn't see suffering. He saw an embrace, arms open wide, welcoming everyone home. That night, as he walked back through the misty streets, he whispered to himself the same words that had started it all. Built upon the foundation of the apostles, with Christ as the capstone. Only now they weren't distant theology, they were lived truth. He was beginning to understand what it meant to belong, not to an institution but to a family held together by grace. When he reached home, he called Emily. "Hey," he said, his voice lighter. "Next Sunday, let's bring flowers for the altar. I think it's time I thank God properly." Emily laughed softly on the other end. "You already are, Mark. You just don't realize it yet." He smiled, looking out the window where the city lights shimmered like scattered prayers across the night. For the first time in years, the darkness didn't frighten him. It felt sacred. The kind of night where God whispered softly through the quiet and faith began to bloom again. March came with restless winds and the kind of sky that couldn't decide between rain and light. The city seemed to carry an edge of tension. Protests on one block, laughter on another, people arguing loudly about everything and nothing. Mark noticed it more than before, maybe because he was trying to live differently now. When you begin to heal, you suddenly see how fractured the world really is. At work, disagreements had been rising between coworkers about policies and ethics, and one afternoon the tension boiled over. A colleague named Ben, frustrated about company changes, lashed out at another employee in front of everyone. The room fell silent. Mark, standing nearby, wanted to intervene but hesitated. Later that day, he found Ben sitting alone outside the building, his face pale and ashamed. "Rough day," Mark said quietly, sitting beside him. Ben exhaled heavily. "You could say that. I lost my temper, probably my job too." Mark didn't know what to say at first. A month ago, he might have avoided the moment entirely, but something inside him stirred, that still voice reminding him of what he'd learned. Peace isn't just found in prayer, it's proven in compassion. "Maybe it's not too late," he said gently. "People make mistakes. What matters is how we stand afterward." Ben looked at him, eyes tired. "How do you stay calm all the time?" Mark chuckled. "I don't. I just stopped thinking I had to be right about everything. I'm learning to choose peace even when I don't understand." Ben gave a small, skeptical laugh. "You sound like a preacher." "Trust me," Mark said with a grin. "I'm still in training." That night, after leaving work, he went straight to St. Anthony's. The church was dim, the candles burning low. He knelt, remembering what the priest had once said about faith being courage dressed as humility. The world outside was noisy with argument and doubt, but here silence became a teacher. He prayed not for success or answers, but for steadiness, the strength to stay kind when anger would be easier. As he knelt, a verse from Ephesians returned to him like a familiar melody. "We are no longer strangers, but members of God's household." He thought about what that really meant, not just unity among believers, but unity among broken people, strangers who were learning how to belong again. When he left the church, the wind had died down, and the moon had emerged from behind the clouds. He walked home slowly, feeling as though something within him was quietly solidifying. A foundation he hadn't realized was forming. A week later, Emily called. "Can you come by?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I just got my latest results." He arrived within the hour. Emily sat on the couch, a folded paper clutched in her hand. "They found something," she said softly. "A shadow on my scan. They're not sure what it is yet." The words hit him like a cold wave. "It could be nothing, right?" he asked, trying to sound steady. "Maybe," she said, "but it might not be." They sat in silence. For the first time in months, fear tried to claw its way back into Mark's chest. He remembered the comfort he'd felt, the peace that had carried him, and suddenly it felt fragile again. He wanted to pray, but the words stuck. That evening after Emily fell asleep, he walked back to the church. The doors were closed, but the small chapel near the side entrance was open. Only one candle burned inside. Mark sat in the front pew, head in his hands. "Why now?" he whispered. "She's the good one. She never stops believing. Why would you let this happen?" The silence answered him first, heavy and suffocating. Then slowly, the words from one of the evening prayers he'd heard so many nights before rose in his memory. "Faith brings stability where doubt brings unrest. When we end the day anchored in God's truth, we find both humility and peace." He closed his eyes, letting the words settle. Maybe faith wasn't about control. Maybe it was about trusting even when life broke your sense of fairness. He thought of Christ in Gethsemane, praying through the night, trembling yet surrendering. "Not my will, but yours be done." The next day, Emily underwent more tests. While waiting, Mark found himself pacing in the hospital chapel. An elderly woman entered, her movements slow but deliberate. She wore a small crucifix and carried a well-worn rosary. When she saw him, she smiled. "You waiting for someone?" He nodded. "My sister." She sat beside him without hesitation. "I'm here for my son," she said. "He's in surgery. I used to worry myself sick, but now I just tell God, you love him more than I ever could. That's enough for me." Mark looked at her, struck by the simplicity of her faith. "How do you trust like that?" She smiled faintly. "I stopped trying to be God's helper. I just let him be God." He laughed softly through tears. "That's beautiful!" She reached over and squeezed his hand. "You're not alone, dear. None of us are." Later that evening, the doctor finally came. "It's benign," he said, smiling. "We'll monitor it, but she's going to be fine." Mark closed his eyes, relief washing over him like warm rain. Emily cried quietly, holding his hand, whispering, "Thank you, Lord." That night back home, he stepped onto his balcony. The city lights shimmered like small flames across the horizon. He breathed deeply, the cool air filling his lungs. He realized how much the journey had changed him. Faith had gone from being an idea to a living rhythm. He no longer saw God as distant or conditional. God had been there in every quiet mercy, in the priest's words, in Emily's strength, in strangers' kindness, even in his own moments of weakness. As he watched the sky darken, he whispered a prayer. "Lord, teach me to be part of your household, to stand firm when storms come, and to love even when I don't understand." And in that moment, he sensed it again, that still, grounding peace that had first touched him under the streetlight weeks ago. Only now, it wasn't fleeting, it was home. The weeks after Emily's recovery unfolded gently, like a song fading into peace. Spring sunlight poured through her apartment windows, filling every corner with quiet warmth. Mark began visiting her most evenings after work, bringing takeout dinners and fresh flowers. They talked about everything and nothing. The books she wanted to read, the trips she still dreamed of taking, and how strange it was that fear could teach faith better than certainty ever did. "You've changed," she said one night as they cleaned up the table together. Mark laughed. "You keep saying that." "No, I mean it," she insisted. "You're softer now. I don't see the worry in your face anymore. You look like someone who's learned to trust again." He smiled, drying a plate. "Maybe I finally realized that control is an illusion. I used to think faith meant asking God to fix everything. Now I think it means trusting him even when he doesn't." Emily nodded thoughtfully. "That's the hardest kind of faith." They stood by the window as twilight turned the sky to lavender. A church bell rang in the distance, and for a long while neither spoke. The moment felt sacred, ordinary but soaked in meaning. The next weekend, St. Anthony's held its annual charity dinner for the homeless. The parish hall buzzed with volunteers setting up tables, decorating with candles and flowers. Mark was now one of the main coordinators, something that still surprised him. A year ago, he wouldn't have even attended. Now it felt like a calling. As he arranged the serving trays, Father Gabriel, the priest who had first welcomed him, approached with his familiar gentle smile. "You've become quite the leader here," he said. Mark shook his head. "Just trying not to mess things up." The priest chuckled. "Humility is the first sign of grace, but I'll tell you something. Faith becomes real when it moves from our lips to our hands. Tonight, you'll see what I mean." And he did. As people arrived, some in worn coats, some shyly clutching their children's hands, the hall filled with warmth that no candle could create. Volunteers served food, laughed with guests, and shared stories. Mark noticed one man sitting alone near the corner, shoulders hunched, avoiding eye contact. Something about him felt familiar. That old posture of despair he once knew well. Mark grabbed 2 plates of food and walked over. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. The man hesitated, then nodded. Up close, Mark saw how tired he looked. Maybe 40, maybe 60. Suffering had aged him in ways time couldn't. "Name's Peter," the man said quietly. "Haven't been here before." "Welcome," Mark said. "I'm glad you came." Peter's eyes flicked up. "You really mean that?" "I do," Mark said simply. "I used to sit where you are. Not here exactly, but I know what it's like to feel lost. You're not alone." The man stared at him for a moment, then nodded slowly, as though weighing whether to believe him. "I used to pray," Peter admitted, voice trembling. "Then life got hard. I figured maybe God stopped listening." Mark smiled gently. "Sometimes silence isn't God's absence, it's his invitation to trust." Peter looked down, his lips quivering. "I wish I could believe that." "You will," Mark said softly. "You just did, by walking through that door tonight." They ate quietly after that, and though no miracle happened, something sacred did. Two broken hearts recognizing home in one another. Later, after everyone had left, Mark stood alone in the parish hall. The lights dim, the candles still flickering on the tables. He thought about the past year, the fear, the prayers, the hospital nights, the small acts of faith that had built something solid beneath his feet. He remembered Bishop Sheen's quote Father Gabriel had once shared, "Skepticism is never certain of itself. Faith brings stability where doubt brings unrest." Mark realized now that faith had become the architecture of his life. Each prayer, each act of service, each surrender a stone in a cathedral built inside his heart. That night, walking home beneath a sky littered with stars, he whispered a prayer of gratitude. "Thank you, Lord, for not leaving me where I was, for teaching me that unity isn't about agreeing on everything, but about loving even when we don't, for showing me that peace isn't a feeling, it's a person." When he reached his apartment, he sat by the same window where months ago he had first whispered his confused prayer, "If you're still near, help me find my way back." The city glowed below, alive with motion and noise. But within him, there was stillness. He reached for Emily's old rosary, the one that had started it all, and let the beads slip through his fingers. He thought of St. Paul's words again, built upon the foundation of the apostles, with Christ as the capstone. He finally understood. Faith wasn't about never falling. It was about being held together when everything else falls apart. And that unity, that invisible thread binding strangers, families, and souls across time, was love. A week later, Emily joined him for evening mass. The choir's voices filled the church like light breaking through stained glass. During communion, as the organ swelled and the people moved forward together, Mark felt something lift in his chest, a quiet joy, full and steady. He watched the line of worshipers, young and old, rich and poor, weary and strong, and thought, this is the living temple St. Paul spoke of. This is what it means to belong. After Mass, Father Gabriel spoke briefly to the congregation. "Faith," he said, "is not a feeling that visits and leaves. It is a home that waits for you. No matter where you've been, it will always welcome you back." Those words echoed in Mark's mind as he walked out into the evening air. The sun was setting, and the world seemed washed in gold. He felt as though every heartbeat, every breath, every person passing by was part of one vast, divine rhythm. Emily smiled beside him. "You're quiet," she said. He nodded. "Just thinking about how far God brought us, how all of it, the pain, the fear, the silence, was grace in disguise." She slipped her arm through his. "Then maybe that's what faith really is, seeing grace where the world only sees struggle." He looked up at the sky, where the first stars had begun to appear. "Yeah," he said softly, and knowing we're never strangers again. They walked home together beneath the deepening dusk, the city lights shimmering like thousands of tiny altars. Mark knew the world would still have storms, fear, doubt, and division, but he also knew something stronger now lived within him. The peace of the Sacred Heart, the unity of a love that cannot be broken. And as he closed his door that night, kneeling once more in prayer, his final words were simple but full. "Lord, thank you for bringing me home." If this story touched your heart tonight, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe so that others might also find peace in God's presence. And in the comments below, share your prayer intention. We'll lift it together in faith as one family in Christ.